So good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to welcome you to this Ideas Made to Matter series. Let me give you a general sense of what we're doing here in the second of our series. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to disrupt communities, industries, and economies at a global scale. It creates new challenges and uncertainty for all of us and global business leaders. With this in mind, we've invited MIT Sloan faculty members to come together and share their latest research and insights in this summer event series. We've begun, this is the second of the series, to explore the direct implications of the global pandemic, as well as non-coronavirus topics. As I'm sure you'll agree with me, that MIT is uniquely positioned to address the challenge of this moment across numerous dimensions, from healthcare to finance, workplace policy, to supply chain management, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and beyond. This series is aimed to provide us with the opportunity to hear directly from faculty addressing these issues in real time, and to reaffirm thereby why research at MIT Sloan matters so much in the world. So I'm Ezra Zuckerman-Sivan. I am Sloan's Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning. And it is a great pleasure for me to introduce my dear colleague, Roberto Rigobon. Roberto is the Society of Sloan Fellows Professor of Management in our Applied Economics group. He is also the group head for Applied Economics. And I've had a pleasure to work with him the last few years in my role as the Deputy Dean, responsibility for faculty affairs. Roberto, I'm sure he'll smile now when I cause him to remember all of the work we've done together. It's been a great pleasure. Roberto, you should know, is a Course 14, that is Department of Economics alum, who moved a couple of floors up in E52 back then to join the Sloan faculty in 1997. We've had the great pleasure of having him on our faculty ever since. Roberto is a macroeconomist whose expertise, first and foremost, is in international economics, monetary economics, and development economics. He is much more than your typical macroeconomist, though, if anyone who knows him. You can see that right away. It's very unusual for macroeconomists to have the set of interests that Roberto has, including he is the co-director, the co-faculty director of the MIT Sustainability Initiative, together with John Sturman, working together with Jason Jay, Bethany Patton, fantastic crew. Today, Roberto will be speaking about many of the difficult decisions facing businesses and all of us in this day and age. In particular, Roberto will be talking about a framework that he's developed, I think, together with Jason and others over the years and implemented, called the Promise Framework. And it's a guide for thinking through, really grappling with the importance of ethical business decisions. What I understand, Roberto, is that you are going to be sharing with that framework with us and exploring with us and sharing with us how your thinking and engagement with respect to that framework have been impacted by the pandemic. I know I'm really eager to hear about that and to share ideas with you. And so I want to turn things over to you. You're already showing your video, which is great. You're ahead of the curve. And I want to remind folks that, Roberto's going to speak with us for about 20 minutes now, I think. And afterwards, I'm going to lead a Q&A. I want to invite folks to, if you have a question that you want to ask of Roberto, to put that question in the Q&A app. I'll monitor those, and I want to thank Lauren and Patsy. We'll be monitoring those and do my best to share those questions with Roberto, and we'll have a great conversation. So Roberto, thank you.
First, thank you, Ezra, for being here. It is, I always wonder if Ezra actually sleeps even for a second a day with the tremendous work that he's leading and how we're going to open up MIT Sloan in the fall. I think that I receive emails from Ezra at every single hour of the day, and I know he's not traveling. So it's very remarkable. So thank you so much for taking time of that. amazingly busy agenda to be here. So, and also thanks to all the participants for being here. It's a great pleasure. I will. A lot of this research happens among many different people and collaborators, so it's not me or exclusively my credit at all. So I work with amazing people in the sustainability initiative and also in this research in particular called the aggregated confusion. Let me tell you a little bit about how all of this started. So Jason, Jay, and I for a long time have been thinking about how can we define or how can we detect if a community is sustainable or not, but in a very broad definition of sustainability that we usually call social well-being. And through the years, we came up with this nice word called promise that reflects every dimension that we think is important. The P stands for personal aspects. The R is for relationships. O is for organizations, cultures, and labor, things that happens within firms. M is for the markets and the economy. The I is for the institutions and kind of the rules and customs that we follow as a society. The S is for social and politics, and the E is for the environment. And when you think about it, if I think about any community, any state, any country, the world as a whole, if we really want to be sustainable as a species, we need to pay attention to all of this. I think that we treat many aspects very badly. As we as a species, I mean, we treat the environment very badly, we treat each other very badly, and we treat ourselves very badly. So I think that it is almost kind of a miracle that we have not disappeared as a species, because the way we treat each other and all the time. So I think that we need to find a framework to highlight how that happens and that we are aware. We don't offer a solution per se, okay? Just it is more like a guidance, things that you have to pay attention. So again, if you have a country where people are super happy, so the P is very high, but the economy is in disaster, the institutions are horrible, there's huge amount of corruption, the society is always upset, the political system is a disaster, the environment is being destroyed. Well, that doesn't look like a very sustainable place. We call that combination of very bad events, we call them Brazil. And Brazil doesn't look very sustainable to me. On the other hand, if you have a country where the environment is well taken care of, the politics is working relatively okay, all the aspects of the society are relatively stable in terms of treatment of different individuals and different communities. The economy is working fine, but people are super unhappy. Well, that doesn't look very sustainable either. So that we call that France, and we need to find a balance, and we need to find a balance among all of these. So for many years, I have spent time thinking about measurement. So if you have seen any of my previous talks, I am totally obsessed with how to measure things. So how to measure the economy better. And that was a work that I started together with Alberto Cavallo. Alberto was an MBA. A lot of you are going to be or have been. So Alberto was an MBA from MIT. Then he went to Harvard to do his PhD in economics. And then when he returned as a faculty, we started working on how to measure inflation rate better and how to use alternative data sources. And by the way, it was mostly Alberto. I just piggyback on that, on him. So, but then with Julian and Florian, which are two postdocs that spend time at MIT, we started thinking about how to continue measuring different aspects. So for a long time, I have been spending time about how to measure. And the reason is that how can you make decisions about these 7 dimensions? So, I mean, Sandra is asking what is the acronym, is PROMISE, personal, relations, organizations, markets, institutions, social and political, and environment. So how can you make decisions if you measure this horribly? And when you think about it, we measure the economy, the M, the markets, relatively well. But how do we measure how we treat workers? we measure that very badly. In fact, we usually wait until people are being mistreated to realize that we have made a mistake. And so we see that all the time when either workers quit their jobs or they file complaints in a labor court. And by the way, this is very dependent on the country and the culture. For example, in Europe, in Latin America, I am from Venezuela, so it is very common to go to a labor court. It's actually very, very common. So if you have grievances, you just go to and present a complaint in a labor court. In the United States, it's very rare that you do that. And again, the labor market in the US is merciless in that sense. So people quit. And so how do you measure in Citibank how you are treating the workers? Well, it will depend on which subsidiary are you measuring. When you look at Citibank Mexico and Citibank France and Citibank Argentina, well, they will have a different behavior than Citibank the US. And in that sense, actually how to make sense of the statistics is very complicated. Furthermore, you are measuring very late. You're measuring after you have mistreated people. You are not measuring the process of mistreatment. You are measuring the impact of a continuous process of mistreatment. And then at the end, you observe this extreme event. Consumption of drugs. For example, Bethany Patton on the S Lab, the Sustainability Lab, she organized a whole class last year as a capstone of the Sustainability initiative at MIT. She organized this class surrounding the opioid crisis that we have in the United States. And again, in sustainability, you will say, well, where's the environment there? Well, in the opioid is less evident where the environment is, but clearly the opioid crisis is a social, massive social, personal issue. And so therefore, when you think about that in the PROMIS framework, it's a very big component of touches many bases of that word. And now, how do we measure actually consumption of drugs? We measure that horribly. We wait until we count people that have an overdose. So I mean, give me a break. That's incredibly late. So for many years, I've been thinking about how to measure better. I think that we measure very infrequently. Most of the statistics, for example, on labor treatment are yearly. So I mean, it's really hard to improve when you measure only once a year. We tend to measure only extreme events, like what I'm describing. So environment, we wait until the lake is lost. Social unrest, we wait until you have the situation like in Venezuela, massive human rights violations that lead people to in an exodus. So you have 5.5 million people leaving my country, and my country has only 36 million. So you have a massive amount of people leaving the country, or you have social unrest in the form of riots in the streets. So again, I don't know, but that sounds like a very extreme event. We measure relationships very badly. We only measure when they are broken. We measure personal health very badly. We diagnose depressions. So we don't measure sadness. We wait until it's kind of too late. So for a long time, and by the way, still working on how to measure the different dimensions of sustainability. And a lot of the research that I have done with many people at MIT, what we're doing is trying to emphasize how to improve the measurement. And the idea is that we want to measure the process. Measure continuously, so measure much faster than when we measure, and we cannot make decisions if we only make once a year. We also want to measure the process, so the process of treatment, and as opposed to the outcomes of bad treatment. I also want to measure the second one, but I would like to prefer to make decisions before we make tragedy. So again, discrimination in the United States today will have the same issue. So I would like to measure the process of discrimination, not the horrible outcome of a prolonged period of discrimination. Then, it's kind of too late already. So we cannot improve if we don't have these continuous measures that are evaluating the process. Now, one aspect that I did pay less attention in that framework of PROMIS was how different people are. So actually, by the way, so in the classes, we were running these surveys, and we were telling the students, well, here you have 10 points or 100 points. I mean, it's kind of irrelevant. So how do you allocate the 100 points among the different letters? No? How important for you are personal aspects versus social aspects versus economic aspects, etc. And for a long time, I was not truly paying too much attention to that. I said, well, people are different, so who cares? No, kind of, I said, like, we have to find a solution about how we're going to fix our differences. At least we have one single framework where we can speak all together. But for a long time, I was not paying too much attention to that aspect. I think that was a mistake because today I'm kind of obsessed on measuring those trade-offs. So how much are we willing to take one person out of poverty? How much are we willing to pay for that? That's an interesting question. How much are we willing to pay to stop social unrest? How much are we willing to pay for a vaccine for COVID? I don't know, but it sounds like a lot. Given how much we're spending on avoiding the contagion, I think that, if Moderna finds a cure, why not give them $1 trillion? I mean, that would be cheap. Comparison to what we're doing, that sounds like a super cheap. By the way, if I tell any pharmaceutical company that we will give them $1 trillion if they find a vaccine, probably we'll get a vaccine by September. So truly, kind of, how willing are we to pay for these things is something that we don't ask regularly. We very rarely ask those questions. And in general, the issues that we discuss aspects in a very virtuous way. Kind of, this is how ethics, one of the way of thinking about ethics is that we highlight the goodness of everything, which, by the way, I'm not against that. I'm totally in favor of that. I do that as a human being all the time. But when you make decisions in the society, I think that we need to think about trade-offs, and because our resources are limited, especially human resources and our time. COVID made me realize that many countries were making those decisions and they were completely blinded. So they had no idea what they were doing. In fact, they never asked a question. I work a lot with emerging markets, and I was seeing emerging markets having the trade-off of if I put many people in lockdown, that's going to cost me lives through many mechanisms. One is domestic violence, for example. Another one is depression. Another one is, starvation. So if I put people in lockdown, how much are they going to suffer? Versus if I allow them to get infected, and how many are we going to lose because our healthcare system will be overwhelmed? That is a horrible trade-off, don't you think? And in fact, actually, I listen to the governor of Georgia right now, and that's exactly the trade-off in the sentence. I mean, when formulates a sentence about why he's not supporting masks, which, by the way, wear a mask. Is that clear? I mean, so I don't care what your political view is or your patriotism or whatever it is. Wear a mask. We know from research that the best way to avoid contagion is to wear a mask. It's super simple. Is wash your hands and wear a mask. Is that clear? We know that works. And for any one of you that as a prospective student that is thinking about coming to MIT or second years that are returning, please wear a mask. Not for you. You might be super healthy, and then the virus will have no symptoms in your life, but for others, because you will become a vector of contagion. So please wear a mask. And by the way, that's part of the decisions that Ezra has to be dealing every single day. But when you think about it in that statement, they are actually talking about that trade-off. And I was doing this research relatively slowly, but COVID made me realize that we needed to push this forward much faster. So I talked to all my students and I said, like, can we do this fast? Can we actually think about a way for people to learn about themselves? How much are you willing to exchange different social issues? So let me just show you. This is not done, okay? So, but in fact, we have not shown this to anybody. It's not working yet. just for the record, as all research is just in the process of working, but it's not working yet. So let me just share my screen so I can show you the app. This app will be in a phone. Actually works in a phone, but let me just show you the internet version. So, but at the end, what people will do is just put their information I'm going to put the US because Venezuela is too low in the list. I'm going to cheat. I'm also a US citizen. I was not born here. Anyway, that's actually my email. Public, so no issue. But anyway, we want to know about how people changes those trade-offs. I'm going to show you in a second, depending on their ethnicity and the employment status, the level of education, the marital status, and something about their income. So this is a part of what we want to do, is to understand how people are going to make choices between very difficult subjects that people have never asked about trade-offs between these two. And the idea is that we're going to ask you, the individuals, to choose three. For example, let me think about, I work a lot on poverty, so poverty for me is extremely important. I work a lot with law enforcement on human trafficking, on the measurement of human trafficking and human rights violations. And let's, I don't know if Dominic works in the sustainability initiative. He's usually in these talks, but, so I don't know if he's here, but he will say, like, I should put civil rights, okay? Which is, let's use civil rights as well as one. So once you choose three of them, what it does is that the machine will choose three very famous charities. So this is one charity. It's called Equal Justice Initiative, which is, you can go and read about this charity. It's super famous, extremely well respected, has a very high score, and then one that is called about poverty alleviation, that is Save Children. And the idea of the game is that people are going to choose allocating money between one and the other. And what occurs is that when you see, you allocate money, and $1 that goes to one charity, you might lose that more than $1 on the other charity. So the idea is that you play the game, and once you play the game, I'm not going to play the whole game, but once you play the game, you press end game, and it will tell you what are your preferences. How much do you care about one versus the other? And it's the idea is not only for us to learn how the society weights, but also for people to understand how they will weight. I think that very few of us have ever asked the question, if I have to devote my resources to solve issues of civil rights versus human trafficking, how I will allocate those resources. I think that we have never asked that question. So I wonder how on earth we make a decision. How do we do that? I think that in reality, what we do is that, you know, we have groups on both sides, and they just try to convince Congress to allocate some budget. We allocate the budget, and then after that, we pray, I guess, and so that the likelihood that that produces the right weight is zero. We need to learn first who we are. The second is that how different we are. That's the part that is not working. Actually, if you go through the whole game, it will tell you how you weight the different three charities that you picked. And also will tell you how willing are you to substitute, to exchange one for the other. And after you do that, the part that we need to do is to show you how you compare to groups that are, or individuals that are similar to you, similar on the socioeconomic conditions that what we collect. So that's kind of what we're working right now. And it's truly amazing because this is done 100% by MIT students. These are all Europes, all undergrads. 100% of these are undergrads that work amazingly hard. And and they have produced an app, and I know it doesn't look that beautiful, but actually works in every single device that we have tested. And what we want to do now is, in some sense, to deploy it. We have already all the permits, so that's fine. But the idea is get to know yourself. And by the way, there are 64 categories. 64. There are 64 different social, environmental, personal causes that we have found among very important charities in the world. So, and the idea here is to allocate money across the charities, and that is very close to your preferences. And that's how we economists think about how will you allocate resources. In the end, in the society, if I ask anybody, the person will say, well, I want less pollution and less poverty. That's a no-brainer. Of course you want less pollution and less poverty. That's everybody will choose that. Now, the question here is, well, imagine that you can't do that you have to improve one and deteriorate the other. Then how will you choose? Now, technology plays a very important role here because technology will allow us to maybe relax some of those trade-offs. And I think that that's actually one of the beauties of what we do at MIT Sloan. You see, if I think about all the problems in the world, they're kind of solved by two things, two ingredients, technology and management. So that's it. So COVID, how are we going to solve the COVID-19 crisis? Well, the coronavirus needs two things. One, management, and that's more or less what we're doing right now. And so we request people to behave properly, that, you know, don't gather in a closed environment, that where people are screaming like a bar. That's a bad idea, a bad idea. So, and we lock down some of them. We decide who goes to school. We decide who stay home. We decide which activities can happen or not. That's management. So one of the parts of what we're doing is to reduce the cost of this crisis is use management. But the second one is we're expecting technology to pick the tab. I said, well, right now the management implies extremely harsh trade-offs in the society. And again, different individuals have coped with COVID differently, and different societies also have had different type of cost of the lockdown, which actually I call it hibernation. It's truly, this is not a lockdown. It's truly a hibernation. We wanted just to stop the economy for 6 months. That was more or less what we wanted to do. But it's really hard to actually stop an economy. So from the macroeconomic point of view, that's extremely hard to do. The economy that we could slow down the most was about 40%, that's it. So truly, it's really, really difficult to stop an economy immediately. So what we're doing is management at the beginning, and we're expecting, a vaccine, technology and treatment to pick the tab. It's at the other side. And what Sloan does is we combine those two. That's what we do every single day. Every single day, we're thinking about innovation and technology and how we can actually do things better from the productivity and the use of resources, but also how we combine that with management incentives and culture, organization, and the psychology of the individuals at the level of the organization. I think that in the end, that's the solution of all of these issues. And my research will help less on the technology side, maybe. Yeah, clearly it is less about that. This research is mostly to help the management. So when you're making a decision, how can you weigh them? How can you use them? I am really rushing with this with this app, because one of the things that we would like to do is to use it in class, is to allow our own students to learn who they are, to realize what their values are, how much they weigh the different causes. For the moment, it's going to be 7 or 8. And the reason why we pick this is first because we believe that given today's discussion in the world, people will care about these 8 issues. And so it will be interesting to know how different Peruvians are to Brazilians, and how different Brazilians are to Americans and the Swedish. Very likely we are very different. Very likely our views will change with our life. When I was young, I mostly cared about P. And it was totally personal aspects. And so when I was young, I didn't care. But then I met my wife, and she educated me about the other 6 letters. And then I had kids, and they have made me realize that I should care only about P now. No, I'm joking. So when you have kids, it changes. When they grow older, you change. So very likely our values are not even stable through time. They change by subjects. And I cannot imagine we are less concerned today about civil rights than we were 5 years ago. But that doesn't mean that the problems are different. They were probably exactly the same, but we didn't have any measurement. We were not paying attention. We were unaware. But so therefore, when when problems like that appear, we are aware, and very likely our weights in those exercises will change through time. So I want to learn all of this about all of us. So how do we change? What factors move as a society in one direction versus the other? And then how do we weight, environmental, social, and governance issues differently? So this research is going to be called the ES machine, because I think what we're going to try to do is to measure and report this through time, through different groups, and hopefully this helps all of us learn a little bit about ourselves. Let me stop there because I promised 20 minutes, and I think I have taken a little bit longer than that. And let's see if there's
right on time, Roberto. That was great.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I have the great privilege of being able to ask you a few questions that I want to ask myself, and then I want to see if I can get some of the questions that people have started to ask on the Q&A app. One question I guess I have to, so as I understand it, there's a what economists would call a positive, or maybe the rest of us call sort of a descriptive a set of questions, and then a normative set of questions, right, that you're interested in. And as I think I understand it, there's part of the way that you're organizing your research and your teaching and your engagement around this. There's a set of positive questions, like how does the world actually work, that will then help to shape our normative. Is that right? And so, and there's a, I mean, it's interesting because it sounds like there's sort of a bet, right? And the bet is that we implicitly make these trade-offs, that they're driven, this is where I'm hesitating between, are they actually driven or they should be driven in some sense by our values, and that, and then there's there seems to be some degree of consistency between the same person over time, and then maybe in the aggregate of societies over time.
Yeah.
And then if we can then have that degree of self-knowledge about ourselves and about our societies, then we can maybe start to reprioritize, right? Is that fair enough? And
yeah.
I guess my question is so for A, is that right? And then B, which of those stages do you think is we know the least about, and then we'd actually would help to really orient us if we knew.
So I think that the one that we know we do the work. Let me say a little bit what I think we know in general in the literature. What we do know is that when you take three individuals that have three different preferences, each one is individually rationally, but collectively they will be irrational. We know that there was a very famous Corbusier, yes, it's a very famous paradox of voting, but the most famous one, we gave a Nobel Prize award to Ken Arrow in 1971. So truly, we know that when people have different preferences, making a choice for all is extremely, extremely hard. And by the way, you as a dean probably have experience a little bit dealing with all our different preferences, and then you have to aggregate our
group heads also.
And group head, no, especially group heads. I'm a tough cookie. So, but you see, it's aggregating those differences. I know that is a big question that we have. So now you're right. I want to first reveal some information about ourselves. So that will be good. So that we know. Second one, I hope that once you phrase our discussion by looking at the different causes that we have, we might realize, Ezra, you and I, that we have way more in common than what we have in disagreement. I think that the narrative, for example, if I were to ask 100 random Americans, which very likely 50 will be Democrats, 50 Republicans. So let's say 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 independent, okay? If I pick in the United States 100 random individuals and I ask them what is the country they want to build, and I ask them that they need to put 50 characteristics, I'm pretty sure that the first 5 will be different, the other 45 will be identical. Very likely they will say, all of them, some form of equality, fairness, some form of success, education. I mean, they will all name things that they are all in common. Now, instead of us asking what we want to build, the narrative is what we want to destroy. Our narrative continuously is what I don't like about you and what you don't like about me. So we concentrate on those first 5. And it's very destructive narrative. So one of my hopes is that first, by realizing how different we are, but also by realizing that we both care about all the things. If we care about all the causes, it's just that you care a little bit different than me, it might initiate a different conversation. And therefore, then we will be able to aggregate. So that probably is too optimistic. I actually played a very similar game with members of a Congress of an emerging market, where I asked the trade-off between people dying because of an overwhelmed healthcare system or people dying because of poverty. And they did not realize how similar they were in their choices. They couldn't believe it. Right now in Congress, we're discussing, the US still is on extremely bad shape macroeconomically. Clearly the households need some support. Maybe they don't need $600 a week, maybe it's 300 the number, okay? But the households need support. They continue to need support in the United States. Look at the discussion in Congress. It's sad. It's terribly sad. Now, if I ask any of them, what is your objective in life? Both will tell me, well, I want to support 75 million people. I said, okay, well, that's good. Why don't you start with that statement? By the way, both want the same. And you just take all the nuisance on that 5, concentrate on the 45 and solve it. So I think that's it's also about providing a little bit of pragmatism to the discussion. And maybe this is my frustration of dealing with authorities in Latin America. Maybe that's actually the motivation.
I want to ask one more. That was very compelling. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I want to ask. So there's a bunch of questions I want to get to in the question. Maybe we just try one more, which is, your focus on trade-offs. So it's really interesting. Someone might say, what is the macroeconomist doing, trying to give us guidance on how do we grapple with such tough ethical questions, and then the discipline of the trade-off seems to be very powerful. And I'm wondering, it's interesting, in the field of strategy, which I teach in, there's a long-standing debate between 2 different orientations. And you sometimes hear this from people in, essentially, in economist view, originally made famous by Michael Porter, right? Where you basically, it's all about trade-offs, and you have to find your place. Basically, are you going to be low cost, or are you going to be, a differentiator or something like that? And you can't get caught in the middle. And there's a sharp trade-off. And then there's a sensibility that comes out of operations management in particular, is reflected in the quality movement and related movements ever since, which is extreme, has a very negative reaction to that, and says if you focus too much on the trade-offs, then you're going to miss the complementarities, and you're going to miss the possibilities for pushing out the frontier. And I think the counter to that, imagining the counter to that, is that is too much of a license to woolly-headed, undisciplined thinking, right? That basically is going to. So I'm curious what your reaction to that is in this context.
So actually, I would say that they don't disagree.
You're what?
I said that I will agree with both. Or
sure, me too.
When they ask me the question, I would say it depends. So the issue, I agree. So I mean, let's put a different examples. I mean, Ezra. So right now, COVID has destroyed supply chains in the world. I mean, we have excessive amount of pork produced in the United States in the farms, and we cannot get it to the consumers. Okay, so that's an example of a massive failure. So that was the Porter view, that I do a supply chain that maximizes efficiency. So I get the lowest cost at every point in time, and just produce, distribution of pork at the cheapest possible way. And not only that, electronics, think about how the global supply chain is constructed. They're missing robustness. They're missing resilience. So, those trade-offs truly in economics exist. By the way, we macroeconomists, the only thing that we think is about trade-offs, because you see, in macroeconomics, the resources are finite. So we always have to think about, well, when you put money on one, then you have to take it from the other. So, I was talking to John Sterman also in the Sustainability Initiative, and we were thinking about, well, what will be the impact of a carbon tax on labor? And my reaction is nothing. Because you see, we are macroeconomists, I have to apologize, but we macroeconomists immediately say like, wait. So if you fire people that are working in the energy production, then another sector will expand, and therefore the workers will, through time, find a job in the other place. So there will be a transition, but in the end, yeah, we will find employment. So just, you know, I mean, you have to find me an excuse why people don't want to work. So work is never fun. That's why they pay you. So in some sense, you know, at the end of the day, there's a salary at which, you know, the workers will go from one place to the other. So when people tell me, well, the technology is going to substitute us, my immediate reaction is, wait, some, but not all. And again, there's a salary at which, you know, people will shift from one place to the other. So macroeconomists,
you're in this case massaging over the adjustment cost might be significant, right?
Exactly. I mean, so there's an adjustment cost. So for example, Julia asked a very relevant question. Let me answer that because it's very related to this. Julia asked, well, why the relationship is not one-to-one? And very good question, Julia. The reason why we don't have a one-to-one relationship is because in reality, actually, transferring funds from one place to the other implies some losses. So in reality, deciding, should I build a train or more airports? There's a cost of doing these transactions. And therefore the money is not that fungible. So in the end, you know, sometimes a dollar in one particular industry will have a bigger productivity gain, will have more benefits than others. We reflect that by different. So these are all chosen randomly. So the game gives you random slopes, and with that, we will know the slope of your preferences. So let me give you an example where everybody will kind of make the same choice. And by the way, this was a conversation with psychologists, and was fantastic research. The person was evaluating tolerance, and they were evaluating, you know, how intolerant is society. So how intolerant you are toward. In fact, there were 5 categories, but let me just use 2 of them, just for the sake of the argument. They said, well, how intolerant you are toward women, and how intolerant you are toward, for example, African Americans. Okay, so let me just pick 2. There were 5. This was bigger, more comprehensive. So they do these surveys, and then the question was, well, how do I rate the companies? How do I give the score? So imagine that I have a score of 74 on treatment of women and 64 on treatment of African Americans. So what should be my score? The average? And you see, that actually is not the case. We as individuals and organizations, we are as intolerant as the individuals that we treat the worst. It's kind of the minimum. And in fact, in that world of intolerance, we will not accept a single trade-off. You see my point? We will say, no, wait a second. And it's not like you can, let me treat women better and treat African Americans worse. Everybody will say, you're crazy. That's absolutely unacceptable. So truly, that implies a certain preferences and certain choices. That means that if I give you, for example, different slopes, Julia, you are very likely to make the same choice in all of them, because that implies a certain form of unwillingness to exchange one for the other. And that's a very important aspect of our decision making. If we think that, you know, I am unwilling to exchange one activity for the other, that implies that I need to have kind of a fixed budget between the two. And it has implications on budget, it has implications on decisions. And
on this, I have one question which sort of relates to what I was saying before also about trade-offs. So someone, I think it's Robert Lynch, wants to push you on the discipline of the trade-offs, and how do we think, this is the last question in the set, I'll come back to the others. Surely there are you know, complementarities among some of these.
Oh, yes, no, in fact, that's absolutely correct. So in fact, first, if I give you 2 different causes, okay, you might be completely, this is called substitutability and complementarity. let me put it this way. There are some issues in life in which we will be willing to substitute one for the other. Is that okay? Like, pink, I think this is pink or salmon, I don't know. So anyway, whatever my color. So do I substitute a pink for a blue? Yeah, no problem at all. That's it's substitutability. I don't care which shirt I'm wearing, so just give me one, okay? So in that sense, that's substitution. The example about tolerance is about complements, that you are completely unwilling to exchange one for the other. And there are different degrees of that. So truly, we are going to estimate not only the weights, but also that complementarity. So you're right. There are two things that will go hand in hand. For example, civil rights and treatment of labor are very likely to go hand in hand. You see my point? So in fact, if I improve one, I might want to improve the other one. So or improving one could improve the other. So poverty and domestic violence, for example, they tend to go hand in hand, you see? So there are many of these issues that in practice, the trade-off is not as strict, but so and also there are other issues in which our preferences imply, incredibly stark trade-offs. So it's a combination of things. One is what happens in reality in terms of different social causes, but also then how are we? How inflexible are we? So that question is correct. I mean, we're very different ourselves. Like you and I, Ezra, we will be different for sure. But also, if I look at even the same causes, you and I are different, but I am different between two pairs of causes. Very likely. Yeah.
I want to ask your thoughts on the first question that's on there. I think it's very interesting to think about. So how we make these decisions, right? It sounds like a lot of what you're saying is we make them sort of implicitly without being very reflective about, what we really care about. They're built into political processes, and maybe they're sort of taken away from us by those political processes in some way. And what I hear in the first question here, Jay Lopez, is that AI in particular, but maybe, I could see this, the answers to these questions, approach these questions historically being embedded even in mechanical machines that we may have adapted in some ways to solve problems for us. But I'm curious, how you think about that.
It is so I in next academic year I will be teaching a class with Joe Doyle. He's one of our best health economists in the world, and he's in the Sloan School, and we're going to be teaching a class on econometrics. And Joe and I have decided that we're going to add from a total of 24 sessions. We are having 4 sessions on ethics, because the artificial intelligence inherits the biases that you have in the data, and therefore, so we cannot separate the ethical aspects from the statistics aspect. And our TA, her thesis was on ethics and artificial intelligence. So I don't have the answers to these issues, but certainly, you see, if you have a bias in the society, the artificial intelligence that you train in the data generated by that society will inherit that bias. It's very unfortunate, but again, I mean, think about it. If they blame me for everything that goes wrong in my house, the best predictor that something will go wrong in my house is me. It's called marriage, by the way. That's artificial intelligence. I'm not taking
that bait, Roberto. I can tell you right now.
but in some sense, you see, the statistics are more merciless than humans, and therefore, there's a famous study in Florida about that. So I don't know if my research will help on that. Actually, that's a very good question. I have to think a little bit harder. I don't know. I don't know.
So here's a human-related question, which is, I see from Sandra Contreras. And I guess this is a more broader question, which is about So using human beings' responses to your prompt, right? In the apt, and how diagnostic is that? Does it prime them essentially to be much more ethical than they really are? I guess is one way.
Yeah. So if people want to use,
I think the last question is also interesting to relate to that.
Sorry.
Or the last one I saw, which was oh boy, there's a couple other ones now. It was about so at 6:45, anonymous attendee. So it relates to this issue of maybe so if people are balancing ethical objectives, there's also objectives that we might not frame in such ethical terms, right?
Yes.
Growth. Yeah.
Yes, economic. Well, but I mean, the economic growth will be in the M. Yes, exactly. So, for example, I mean, to be honest, poverty alleviation, we know that the best two tools to help the poverty, so to reduce poverty, is to grow and to have macroeconomic stability. Now, it happens to be that growth and macroeconomic stability are the two best tools to increase inequality. Very few people know that, but it is a fact in economics. I mean, think about it. If I create conditions for growth, the people with higher amount of resources, higher education, less financially constrained are the ones that take the first opportunity. So they shoot up in the income distribution. So it is so interesting because this trade-off has been in the literature for ages. It's Kuznets curve. And so I think 1920s maybe. So we have always, I mean, by the way, and I'm kind of rediscovering to the question, but it is a case that if you wanted to solve poverty alleviation, you are going to increase income inequality. And it's just, and the reason is that in a poor country, when you start, your institutions, your welfare state is not designed to provide the transfers and the support that you will require once you become rich. See, the idea is that you are poor, you become rich, and once you're rich, then you reinvest. And the history of the United States is exactly that. And the history of most countries goes to that. I mean, France was very unequal. It just happens to be that it's equal today because they have invested. But go to the 1700s, it was extremely unequal. So truly, that process is that you need the growth, then you realize that you have a problem in inequality, and then you invest in the institutions and, more institutions, organizations, culture, and education to do the transition to a society that is a little bit more fair. But by the way, there are some countries like us in the United States that we just never invested. Okay, so being rich doesn't guarantee that you do the investment, but you need it.
It's back to the positive and the normative.
Yeah. So I think it's in the end is exactly what that question is. The economic growth will, in some sense, force you to use more resources, and then you will have environmental issues. Labor treatment is usually, you force people to work longer hours and worse conditions. You take shortcuts. A lot of economic growth comes through shortcuts, and the shortcuts imply some unintended consequence. It's on regulation, on everything, labor treatment, regulation, lending, not understanding the financial instruments that you lend to the poor, you allow them to buy the house, and then we have the 2008 financial crisis. So growth comes in general when you force it, comes with unintended consequences. So at the end, the difference is that the trade-offs of financial mismanagement, you get them relatively short, you see? And that's the beauty of debt and financial crisis. You misbehave, 10 years from now, let's talk. It's short. But
so here I thought you were going to give us the magic bullet that was going to, which of the PROMISE we could focus on, and then we'll be done. But
no. It's just the issue is that when you screw up on the M, Ezra, you notice faster. That's it. When you screw up on P,
right,
that's mental health. Like, for example, right now, I am terribly. I mean, it's one of the issues that actually is, taking most of my hours of sleep right now is domestic violence in the United States. So I was thinking about, we have 30 million households on stress, okay? And we send those families to quarantine together. So I sent one person to the place where the violence takes place, and I just hacked up the stress level. When are we going to measure the negative impact of that? I am just terrified, I'm telling you, absolutely terrified. So yeah, that's what keeps me awake lately.
And well, all I can say is that we're fortunate that we have you that's on your radar screen and hoping to bring it to ours in part with this framework. Before we conclude, there are a couple of questions that were about basically how people can access the app and how they can use it. And if you have a word about that before we conclude, that'd be great.
So we are going to, so it's not ready yet. What we are doing now is testing this among all the individuals from the sustainability initiative. In fact, the app has improved a lot by us testing. We are testing ourselves, okay, for the moment. But I think that by September, October, we will have the app, and I'm pretty sure that we will make an announcement through MIT on that one. It's going to be called ESG Machine. There's a webpage, and I have a URL. GoDaddy. so we are building all this in such a way that we can, and we have the server. So we are trying to build this in such a way that we can collect the data, but then return it to the people. But it will go through testing for a while, and so not yet. But I would say that by September we should be done. Yeah, in fact, I have 2 students that they are going to do their thesis on this, so they better collect some data. That's a beautiful incentive.
It is. That is, yes. We both know that's a great incentive. So, Roberto, I really want to thank you. We know how busy you are. It's just that I'm busy, but anyone who knows you knows that you're helping MIT and MIT Sloan, and helping out the world in many, many different ways. And we saw that on display here. We really, really thank you for that. I also want to put a plug in. Next week, we have another in our series, the same time. A week from now, it'll be our dear colleague, Erin Kelly. She'll be talking on a topic that I think you'll find very broadly related. Tough challenges that we face as society, as households and employers. And it'd be related if people are interested. I take a look online. You can Google Erin Kelly and Overload. That's your forthcoming book, and we'll be talking about that. I want to thank Lauren and Patsy and the Office of External Relations and MIT Sloan and the whole community. And I hope everyone is doing well and continues to do well this week. Take care, everybody.
And thanks to you, Ezra, because I mean, it's remarkable that you find the time to do all of this. So thank you for your commitment to Sloan and commitment to all the students here. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Roberto. Take care. Have a good evening, everyone.